Dragon Ball is a massive worldwide conglomerate franchise that in itself has become a legitimate phenomena. And not just in the country of Japan. Outside of Japan, Dragon Ball may be the most recognizable franchise, other than perhaps Pokemon and Godzilla, to ever come out of the country. And its original creator, Akira Toriyama himself, is an extremely wealthy man. While as much as I would love to tell you a rags to riches story about how Toriyama took Dragon Ball and made himself a wealthy man after living a life of poverty and not getting a break, that would not be true at all. Toriyama lived a pretty comfortable life and was already a multi-millionaire when he was working on Dr. Slump in the early 80s, years before Dragon Ball would be released. What is the story of the creation of Dragon Ball that came from the mind of Akira Toriyama? On this edition, the 50th edition, 50 of Dragon Ball In Depth, we go back to not just the beginning, the prehistoric, so to speak, time before Toriyama created Dragon Ball and how this thing came about. Get ready, because the ride begins now. For Toriyama, Dr. Slump was a massive hit. He had a great manga that sold well. He had an anime adaptation that was also airing as the manga was being written, as well as movies and merchandise. So Toriyama's bank account was quite well off. But as an artist and as a storyteller, Toriyama was far from finished. But the early seeds for what would become Dragon Ball would be planted before Slump was even done. Around December of 1982, Dr. Slump hit chapter 150, and supposedly during this time, Toriyama had a discussion with Kazuhiko Torishima, his editor and the man who discovered him, and a man who Toriyama still greatly respects and is consistently in contact with even to this day. So Torishima suggested to Toriyama that for his next work after Dr. Slump, because the audience that read Shonen Jump was mostly young to teenage boys, he suggested Toriyama make a kung fu manga rooted in more action than comedy. Now, it's no secret that Toriyama grew up a huge fan of Bruce Lee and Jackie Chan and was a big admirer of their films. And in addition to that, Toriyama had been fascinated by Chinese culture as well as Chinese architecture and Chinese aesthetics, which would of course be the root of what Dragon Ball would be based on. So in 1983, while still writing Dr. Slump, Toriyama began to think up ideas for what his next manga would be. And then in July and November of 83 would produce two one-shot mangas that would be the precursors to what Dragon Ball would be shaped into, and that is Dragon Boy and the Adventures of Tongpu. Now, I have covered these two manga in explicit detail in previous editions of Dragon Ball In Depth, so please make sure to watch those videos to get the whole story on those two one-shot mangas. But basically, a lot of ideas for Dragon Ball kind of started there. The young boy being strong, the female companion, artifacts they had to find. These are different things that would eventually be, I guess, the trope of what Dragon Ball would become, but Dragon Ball was still about a year away, which takes us to 1984. In 1984, sometime in January, Toriyama finalized the idea of what would become Dragon Ball. Now, it's always been very interesting to look back at the early drafts of what Dragon Ball was and what it was intended to be before the final version and before Toriyama would change his mind and kind of evolve his story. But originally, Toriyama stated himself that if he was going to do a new serial, it was going to be an adaptation of Journey to the West. But Toriyama needed ideas, so what did he do? He took a vacation. April 1984, Toriyama goes to China to do research, to learn more about Kung Fu history, because this story would be Kung Fu comedy in a way that only Akira Toriyama could tell. So after Toriyama returned to Japan from China, he pretty much had it set that Journey to the West was going to become the basis for Dragon Ball. Now, for those who are unaware, Journey to the West is a major folk tale in the Asian world known as Saiyuki in Japan. This was published in 1592 and has over 100 chapters following the story of Buddhist monk disciples who go on this gigantic epic quest to discover more knowledge and go on various adventures. Well, the first of these is the great monkey god known as Sun Wukong, whose name loosely translates to awaken to emptiness. So if you ever think that Goku is an airhead, this is where the idea came from. And Sun Wukong would become the basis of Journey to the West and later Dragon Ball. In fact, if you translate Sun Wukong to Japanese, his name is Son Goku. So there you go. So in May of 84, a month after his vacation was over, Toriyama went to go have a meeting with Torishima and they discussed the concept of what would become Dragon Ball. And Toriyama was a complete mess during this time. He didn't want to even think about Dragon Ball. He spent most of his time playing with model cars trying to get inspiration. And the big revelation of all of this is that he didn't even work on the storyboards for Dragon Ball until sometimes days before the actual publication of the manga. So this guy would rush through submitting it right at the very end, almost not making it. Toriyama is a madman. The serialization of Dr. Slump was going to come to an end in August, and Toriyama only had a few months to get everything finalized and to work on a first draft to submit to his editor. And let me tell you, there were a lot of revisions to this before it actually made publication. In the original draft, Goku was actually a monkey boy, much like the original Sun Wukong. Now, he wasn't quite a god, but he had powers that were superhuman even early on, and he also had a Nyoibo, just like how Goku and Sun Wukong had, a staff, so to speak. And not just that, but if you look at the early designs for other characters like Bulma and Oolong, Oolong was much larger, much more of a sumo-looking guy, and Bulma resembled an American cowgirl. So Toriyama decided he would go to the two people in his life who were guaranteed to give him honest criticism, even if it hurt: his editor and his wife. And both were not fans of these designs. In fact, Torishima rejected these because it was too much like Journey to the West. In addition to that, he felt like readers just would not be attached to this version of Goku. It just wouldn't work. And he talks about this specifically in a Forbes magazine interview from 2016, where he states that the really important thing for boys manga is that you need to make the readers feel like they are connected to the protagonist. There needs to be a very strong emotional connection from the reader to the protagonist, that they see themselves as that character. So if the protagonist in Dragon Ball was a monkey, which was the original plan, then no one could relate to it. That's right from Torishima's mouth. So the idea of making Son Goku an actual monkey in base form was rejected. Of course, Toriyama would revise the concept of him being a monkey god into the great ape / Uzaru form. So Goku was a humanoid boy in the final version, but could transform into a great ape. So it's August of 84. Toriyama submits the first sketches. It gets rejected. We come back in October of 84, the second draft, just a month away from Dragon Ball's scheduled release. And Toriyama submits the second draft. Now, this version looks a lot more like Dragon Ball, where Goku has his trademark classic haircut inspired by Astro Boy, and the girl next to him, which was not called Bulma at the time. In fact, Toriyama referred to her as Pinchy. That's her original name, believe it or not. Look a little bit closer to what they would look like in the final draft. But interestingly enough, if you look at the background, you see Goku not on a cloud, a mystical candy cloud. No, he's on a ship. So Toriyama was already incorporating the science fiction elements in the Adventures of Tongpu that he wrote about into Dragon Ball. And of course, as he moved on writing the story of Dragon Ball, especially into the Dragon Ball Z portion, we saw a heck of a lot more science fiction. But either way, Toriyama wanted to create this sort of hybrid futuristic past world, and you can see that here in this second draft. It wasn't just going to be a retelling of Journey to the West from ancient China. No, this would be a unique exclusive world that Toriyama would create, a fictional world, but one that we as human beings and readers could easily identify with. Now, in addition to the art that Toriyama submitted, he also submitted a sheet filled with all kinds of information about the story and the characters, and this was the first time that we actually got the title of what this manga would be called: Dragon Ball. And he talks about the 7 gleaming balls scattered all over the lands, and if one were to gather all 7 of these artifacts, they could summon a giant dragon who can appear and grant a single wish. Then the Dragon Balls scatter once again, and they must be gathered again. Toriyama wrote all of this in the second draft. He also discussed the characters of Goku, Pinchy, which is Bulma, Oolong, Yamcha, and Puar, who I believe Yamcha's original name was Yamcha. And he talks about how Goku was 14 years old in the second draft, and that his grandfather taught him the martial arts, who was also a hermit, but his grandfather died a couple of years before the story, but Goku has one of the balls in his home as a memento of his grandfather. Then he talks about Pinchy, who was very similar to Bulma in that she was originally a genius with machines, learned about the Dragon Balls due to an old scroll that she found somewhere in the land, and is kind of a girly kind of scaredy cat. So these ideas were kept for the final draft. The character of Oolong was pretty much the same thing in that he is a lazy pervert who cares only about food, even though in the final version he cares more about women, but that's neither here nor there. And he could also shapeshift. So that is, again, something that they kept. Then when it comes to Yamcha and Puar, he overhears the Dragon Balls and becomes Goku's rival. So Yamcha was originally set to be Goku's original rival, maybe his only rival. This is before the creation of Pilaf, according to Toriyama's notes here. But from the very beginning, he was intended to be a cool-looking comic relief character. So those of you who think that Yamcha is a meme, Toriyama had, according to these notes, always intended him to be a goofy first villain and not anything to be taken seriously. And then we have Puar, who, again, same thing as the final one. He can transform. He's Yamcha's buddy. Same idea. But some revisions had to be made because Toriyama again rejected this concept. Now, the concept of the plot of Dragon Ball was fine, but Toriyama felt that the character of Goku was dressed as a goody two-shoes good little boy, and that there was no energy to Goku. So he wanted Goku to get revised once again. So Toriyama went back to the lab to revise the story once more. And this time, Eureka! He hit pay dirt with Dragon Ball. Let's discuss the third and final draft, which would become Dragon Ball. When we examine the third and final draft, we can really see Toriyama's ideas begin to take shape and form into what the series that we all know and love would become. Goku has now been redesigned to resemble his first and second draft sort of combined, where he's got the Monkey King martial arts uniform, he's got the Nyoibo, and he has a tail, but he's not just a regular human boy. However, he is a humanoid boy who is a superhuman martial artist. Now, understand that Toriyama had zero intention of turning Goku into an alien. He was just supposed to be a strong boy who could transform into a monkey at the side of the moon, sort of like an influence from werewolves and things like that, which I did cover in my Dragon Ball in-depth about the lore behind the great apes. But nonetheless, we did not find out that Goku was an alien and not of Earth until Dragon Ball manga chapter 196, which would be about 3 years after this. So Toriyama had no intention of anything involving Goku's heritage at all, at least not involving extraterrestrials. Now, when it came to Pinchy was now called Bulma, and he took the time to go ahead and redesign her, as well as Oolong, Yamcha, and Puar. Not only did Toriyama submit some new character designs for Toriyama's approval, this time he included a very basic plot outline, talking about how, with this version of the story, he would be borrowing ideas from Journey to the West, but turning it into his own story. But he would still be borrowing tons of concepts from the original story, and heck, even the names, like Son Goku, for example. Now, what's interesting is that in the original draft, in this draft, Bulma was on summer vacation and used that time to go hunt for the Dragon Balls, which I don't believe was kept actual published manga. So that's interesting. And also in these notes, Toriyama tells the editor that he's going to be introducing the Kintoon, or the Nimbus Cloud, later on. So he's already kind of got ideas in his head about future chapters and future stories, but Clearly, when you read this manga and when you hear his interviews, Toriyama had no idea he would be writing Dragon Ball as long as he actually did. And in fact, Toriyama himself says in the Shenlong Times interview that he originally intended on ending Dragon Ball after running for only 1 year. But he also had not really planned the story. One of the interesting tidbits that came about during the early days of Toriyama creating Dragon Ball is why he chose to make 7 balls and not 8 or 9 or 6 or 3. In his Adventure Special Q&A, Toriyama states that he originally thought about making 8 Dragon Balls, but he didn't want to make 8 because Hakenden, which is a much older novel featuring 8 samurais that have 8 orbs, had 8, so he thought, okay, let's do 7 instead. That would be one of the final revisions before Dragon Ball would hit the shelves, and history was indeed made when Dragon Ball would begin publication with Chapter 1 on November 20th, 1984. Toriyama would write notes during this premiere stating, "Here I am again, and without having had any time to rest, I am happy but sad too. Still, I'll do my best." And that is how Dragon Ball began. The idea of one man taking inspiration from several places to create a story that would become legendary, translated in many languages, and become an icon of anime, manga, video games, and everything in between. And it all began here. On a personal note, as we wrap up the 50th Dragon Ball In Depth, I want to thank Toriyama for creating this series, because had it not been for Dragon Ball, I wouldn't have made so many incredible friends or been in this position that I'm in, where I can have such a fulfilling and enjoyable career that I genuinely love to do, and I wouldn't be able to entertain all of you, which is the most important thing. So I thank him for that, and I thank you for watching, and for now, I bid you farewell.